What's up, guys? I'm gonna wait till a few more people show up. I'm gonna start in this first episode of Forum Crawl just with the small stakes forum on Run At Once. I think it gets a lot more action than the other forums. I'm not sure exactly why. I think the MSNL and high stakes forums I think used to get more posts. I'm not sure if people are losing faith in the quality of the answers they're getting, or if guys just aren't so gung ho about posting in forums as they used to be. But nevertheless, this is kind of my way of sort of trying to stimulate the community a little more in an effort to get more guys on board with the idea that if we can just figure out how to answer questions with more humility and more accuracy, then it also sort of supports people to ask more high quality questions. I think a lot of the reason that the guys don't ask good questions in forum posts is because they're trying to protect themselves from sounding dumb, because there are so many like total trolls that come in and just troll for the sake of trolling. So I think it gives the forums kind of an unhealthy vibe in general, where you have people afraid to ask humble questions because they're trying to sort of like defend their identity and they don't want to be put on blast by the guys that come in and just point fingers and say that's a fucking dumb question. So the one thing I want to get across before we start up is that this is not going to be a channel where I troll for the sake of trolling. This is going to be trolling for the sake of caring. Like, I really want to see guys get more confident in the types of questions that they ask, and people who respond to questions, I want to see that done from a place of empathy and accuracy, rather than what I think a lot of it is, which is answering a question to either reinforce your own perspective or project your insecurity onto someone who seems more weak-minded than you, so that you can actually try to boost your own ego. It's really fucking pathetic and stupid, but I think it happens a lot. So that will be the type of stuff that I speak very frankly about, is when I see trolling for the sake of trolling going on. You'll hear me point that out, and we'll try to understand the paradigm that that poster is coming from and dismiss it as something that we're not interested in pursuing, just as a community, because I don't think it's doing anybody any good if we don't call people out who are doing something from a hurtful energy, and those people are just confused. Maybe they'll realize that what they're doing is not beneficial, maybe they won't, but we can at least stop giving them power by remaining fearful of their type of input. Everything okay on the stream so far, guys, as far as audio and visual? You can see the numbers for like the small six forum has like 6,000 or so posts. I'm guessing there's just way more guys that are at micro stakes in general, so it's that type of thing going on. 678 said, "What is the direction you're going here? I may have missed it." It's just going to be a once a week episode that I'm titling Forum Crawl, just a different format other than what I'm doing on Monday and Fridays, which is the hand history reviews, submitted by just guys who want to put their hands on blast. So what this will be is me getting through as many forum posts as I can on the Run At Once forums, small stakes through high stakes threads, in the 90 minutes that we have. Let's take a look at our first hand. I'm just going to go straight down the line. So first of all, the thing I think is like kind of interesting is like, how do guys even decide what the title of their post should be? Like, I know it gets hard to come up with like unique post titles, and I sometimes wonder, are guys looking to grab attention? Are guys looking to point out what line the hand is about? I think the title of a post should be something geared around what the overall question being asked is. So I think we could start right there with like, if you're going to ask a good question, the title "check flop with queen queen" is just very vague to me. Like, yeah, it might distinguish the hand in a way, but like it doesn't tell me what you're trying to figure out in terms of what part of your game you're trying to get better at. So like, if this guy's wondering if I should be playing a mixed strategy with queen queen in a certain 3-bet line, maybe his title should be something along the lines of like, defending or supporting for pure strategy play in 3-bet pots, something like that, like something that actually denotes what we're looking at from a more root perspective. Just realize how like check flop with queen queen is very shallow. Where actually when you go to the next one, he sees face up range quads on the board. That's much better because now this guy is giving more data points for the hand, and it's kind of more clear what he's saying. Like if I'm face up as capped with quads on the board, what do I do? So it's a little bit better. It'd be nice if you could set up a night bot so we can type exclam episode so you don't have to answer that over and over. Cool. I didn't even know about that. Seven saying I responded to a few of these. So yeah, I'll go through the guys who respond to, and I'll just be honest if you're being assumptive in the way that you answer certain questions. Brian, if you're watching, I might forget, so can you make a note about that Nightbot thing? That's like a really cool feature I didn't know about. So let's take a look at check flop with queen queen, see what we got. Double question mark too. What's the concept of checking the flop? Will you bet or check, and why? So immediately this stands out as sort of a mixed strategy type question, which is kind of funny because it's what I kind of labeled it as when I was doing my hypothesis for how he could ask a better question. So immediately, if this player is asking a mixed strategy question, we already sort of know what type of paradigm he's coming from. Like, if you're the type of person that's asking, should I bet or should I check? It shows that you're aware of mixed strategies to a certain degree, but I guess it also shows that you're someone interested in playing a pure strategy. So I think that this is better. This initial question is probably better than the poster who would come in and say, it's just a mixed strategy. Because that poster is using a narrow line of vision that's not validating the fact that you could have a pure strategy that's incentivized by environmental imbalances. So let's take a look at the hand and see how it sort of unfolds. Our players on the button, looks like we're at 25 NL. Yeah, he opens. Wait, I don't think it says he's on the button, but why is he acting second? It's weird. Oh, never mind. It's just in bold. Hero's middle position. Hero opens. Looks like we get a call from behind and a call from the blinds. So hero C bets flop, blind folds. Button calls. So his question is, should we bet or check the flop? Okay. So this is a mixed strategy type question. It would be a mixed strategy in theory. Immediately, if this guy's looking for data points for why you'd be incentivized to check the flop or bet the flop, normally what I would say here is look and see how fishy the out of position player is. There's a lot of incentive to play a wider check back range in theory when it's multi-way, because your range just pushes much less equity on average versus the enemies as a unit when it's multi-way. That being said, if you have an out of position player who's just a fish by nature, meaning that he's going to be peeling wide pre-flop and giving you more value post-flop and check call lines, I don't think it makes much sense to sacrifice a street of value with an overpair for balance purposes. So it's something that I implement like quite a bit on the softer sites when you have a high portion of out of position players calling as fish, meaning that on average the out of position player who calls from the blinds is some sort of fish. Like it just happens more often when you're playing on sites like B or C list sites, specifically Bovada. I guess now it's Ignition. But I think this really filters over into any non-Poker Stars site. Like the amount of times you get into a multi-way pot where you have guys who are VPIPing pre-flop higher than they should is way, way more than in PokerStars environments. So that's the first data point you're looking for pushing a mixed strategy to a pure strategy. Now, what would override that? The percentage at which in position puts money into the pot voluntarily on the flop. So if you think in position has a really high stabbing frequency, checking could be good because in position is going to stab really wide behind you, reopen the betting, still get value from the fish out of position. He's sort of like doing the dirty work for you. And then you can even smack him with a check raise if you want. So you're not going to get a good answer to this unless you can identify the relevant data points that push the mixed strategy equilibrium toward a pure strategy play. So let's see what people are saying and see if anybody's on that tip. Betting here surely has to be more profitable than checking. Avoid people who speak in absolutes. Avoid people who are using words like surely, definitely. There's a, there's a vibe of overcompensation in the first sentence. If you can't sense it, take my word for it and try to become more sensitive to the energetic vibe of what this guy's doing. He's responding from a place where he wants to be right. Like, this is a very hard thing to like prove, I guess, but like I've seen enough forum posts and I've worked with enough guys to note the level of humility that someone comes with in their first sentence is very indicative of the paradigm that they come from. A funny thing happened the other day. I had a discussion with a guy who messaged me through Run At Once. I get probably 5 to 10 PMs on Run At Once a month that goes something along the lines of, hey, I'm really interested in starting coaching with you, um, but I'm relatively new and I'm looking to work out some sort of thing for like either coaching for profits, which I don't currently do, um, or just some sort of like general guidelines to like what do I need to do to be your student. So what I started to do with everyone who emails me like that is I say, make a 45-minute strategy video. And I'll sort of like expose this here because I think it's very relevant. So these guys think that they make me a 45-minute strategy video, that I'm actually looking and seeing how good they are as a player. But the first thing that I actually look for is the level of humility that I can sense in their voice. My assistant, who reads all my Run At Once messages for me and forwards me shit, he saw I had a conversation going on with this one guy who seemed to be a relative newbie, and he was like playing 25 NL. He was just transitioning to cash. He didn't even have like Hold'em Manager software or any of that shit. But the first two emails he sent to me, I sensed a very high level of humility in him, and I really just liked the energy that he was coming from. Like, very ambitious, very empathetic. Like, had gone through a personal struggle that he outlined, where I knew that he had a certain degree of perspective on what's genuinely valuable in life. And I followed up with him and I said, okay, I'd be willing to try something with you a little bit different because I have like good feelings. I didn't say that straight up, but like I was already kind of on that tip with him. So I asked him, let's see what you can do in a 45-minute video where you outline your thoughts. My assistant sees this and he's like, hey Nick, just wanted to say, bro, be a little careful here because it seems like you're getting involved with somebody who could potentially be wasting your time, which I appreciate, because he's just looking out for me and he knows how much shit we get from people who aren't for real. So me and my assistant get into this small discussion where I said to him, yeah, but I feel like he's got really good energy about him. And my assistant naturally said something like, yeah, but how much is that actually worth? So my theory is that I would much rather work with someone who's a relative newbie but comes from an extremely humble place than someone who's like a slight winner at 200 NL but is sort of stuck in their ways and more arrogant and wants to basically argue with me about things they want to hold on to in their paradigm that they've been trained to think are correct and that they're not willing to release in order to get better. So you could see there's a conflict of interest in the winning 200 NL player who shows up to a lesson to defend his own points, because there's going to be a lack of trust there between student and coach. The conflict of interest is that the player, the student, doesn't come from a high enough level of humility where he can actually genuinely put his trust in the advice that the coach is giving. The conflict of interest is that everything I tell him that doesn't fit into his paradigm is going to hurt him in some way, and it's going to cause him to become resistant and defensive. And that's what arrogance is. Arrogance is defending your paradigm because you're afraid of having your paradigm broken. So, as I expected, I watched 5 minutes of this newbie's video and I turned it off. And I emailed him and I said, hi, I watched 5 minutes of this and I turned it off because I'm really impressed with the level of humility you come with, and I'd love to move forward with some sort of coaching agreement. So guys who see this, you have a leg up on if you ever send in a 45-minute video to me. The catch is I'm not judging you on your strategy. I'm judging you on your level of humility and your level of availability to truth. Because Your availability to truth dictates your availability to the learning process. Hi there, I watched 2 of your videos on PO a few days ago, building range models, on Run It Once, and asked a friend about it, and he said you have one of the most inspiring blogs on Run It Once, so he linked me and also the Twitch channel. So I'm watching a stream for the first time, and I'm already drawn to it. Thank you, bro. I'm glad you've gotten on the Nick Howard revolution train. Um, I noticed recently that that blog is approaching 1,000 likes, which is kind of cool to see because it feels like I've had it for a very short time, and I guess I have, relatively speaking, like only 10 months or so. But I started that blog at a period where I felt very misunderstood because I was just coming out of the first wave of what I've sort of coined as the independent learning pattern. And I realized that I was doing things a lot different in the community, and I felt very distant from what the community was talking about, specifically in forums. So this should be fun today. But that blog was basically a way for me to organize my thoughts as simply as possible, share my struggle, connect with guys who I thought, like, I really thought there was more guys out there who were going through a similar thing that either didn't have an outlet for relating to it or didn't know how to put it into words. And so that was my point behind expressing myself in that way, was that I felt like I could do it because not only was I further along in the process in terms of like seeing the light out, beyond like the theory paradox that the whole community started to suffer from in 2013, 2014, but I also felt like because I had gained a lot of empathy from just feeling so much pain through that process that I could relate very well with the community doing it. So that's been my sort of goal, and it's been cool to see it scale itself. And I think the blog is like one of the main ways that people contact me through, like, hey, I read this and I have a really, really good read on what you're all about, and it's because I can relate with it so well. So I think that coaches who are trying to scale something should focus more on being as relatable as possible. And in this blog, I've actually been very vulnerable too. I think that's what's made me most relatable. I don't try to hide the fact that I went through a very, very difficult period and that I suffered from a high degree of arrogance earlier in my career. I even said in the description of this forum crawl that, like, I've made a fucking fool of myself on these forums in the past. Like, you can look back on like shit that I used to post, and you'll see guys like Sauce come in and just like ruin me bluntly. And I think he actually was doing it from a place of caring a lot about like getting me better, but sometimes there's just only so much advice you can give to someone who's being arrogant. Like, I remember this one post that was really helpful to me where like I posted on one of Sauce's videos like, hey, what if this guy was raising to induce a bluff or something? And I gave like my entire spiel about how I thought that this could be the paradigm that the opponent was coming from. And Sauce just gave this one sentence post and he was like, Nick, you're thinking too hard. And at the time I was like, oh, fuck. Because I was getting put on blast, first of all, in a public forum for basically overanalyzing something. But in the scheme of things, that post was very beneficial to my growth as a player because I approached it with a level of humility that actually recognized that there was truth behind what he was saying, and even though he was being blunt about it, it was actually the best way to get through the degree of arrogance I was coming from. What's up, Aaron Stefan? I'm gonna get you that shirt, bro. So first and foremost, back to the forum post, we're going to dismiss this guy's post to begin with. We're going to approach his post with a level of healthy skepticism. That is almost a contradiction because I don't think there's many forms of skepticism that can be healthy. But I'm approaching his post by already putting him in a paradigm that's a little bit compensational to begin with. Because if he actually had hard and fast proof, he wouldn't use a sentence like, it surely has to be more profitable. He would just fucking post the data and make it clear why it's more profitable. Or say something like, if the conditions are this, then this is what's incentivized. And if you remember what I just said at the beginning of this, not to like toot my own horn, but like it was, if the big blind is a fish, stabbing is incentivized with queen queen. If in position is stabbing wide, checking is incentivized with queen queen. I think those are the two most valuable data points. So at no point when you're answering a post should you ever see it as beneficial to go into like an absolute declaration of what's right or what's not. Because if you're doing that, you're overlooking the entire point of hand history analysis, which is that incentives hinge on data points available. So if you're not stating the data point and then saying this shifts the incentive this way, you're not operating from an advanced paradigm to begin with. And smarter people are going to dismiss you, and the less intelligent people are going to read you as being intrusive or conflict prone, because that's what this isn't even a bad one. This is like a subtle version of this, but like if someone feels as though you're pushing something on them from a place of just needing to confirm your own paradigm, which is kind of what this is, without using data points that can relate, it's annoying. And it's especially annoying to someone who's looking for an answer because they're coming from an insecurity to begin with, which is why they're posting the hand. Let's see what this guy has to say. Oh, cool. He said, I don't know, I could be wrong though. So he gained some humility back at the end. Let's see what else he said though. Betting for value / charge draws and possibly make the pot heads up on the turn. Checking seems bad here multi-way. So he seems to be valuing betting for protection and getting value right away. And while I do think that that's part of the reason that a betting range exists, it ignores the fact that queen-queen is going to be a mixed strategy in practice. Or at least we could say that overpairs in general are going to be a mixed strategy in practice, because if they're always bet for pure, there's a problem and an imbalance with your checking range. So this comes from sort of a narrow paradigm where the player still puts most of the attention on the context that he comes from, which is trained in bet for protection, and that free cards are scary, which unfortunately is a context that runs rampant in the community, where guys take potentially negative EV lines on a current street to avoid a harder spot on a future street. I've seen that a lot with students lately. It's one of the harder things to train out, because there's a certain aversion to that. Like they're really flinching away at taking the line that demands more of them, because they've been trained that it's easier to just run from the problem right now. So this guy says, Poker Snowy told me to check it even with 1 or 2 players. Really don't know why. Delete that fucking program from your computer. The problem with it is that it doesn't help you develop any sort of context for the type of shit that it tells you to do. Without that, a program is useless, because it's constantly just going to spew answers to you, but you're never going to be able to put them into any sort of map that allows you to replicate them accurately. I'd never use Snowy. So in a way I'm biased, but I know what it does and I know what it lacks. It lacks being able to contextualize the type of answers that it gives, and I've also been pretty unhappy with a lot of the solutions that it pumps out in general that people have showed me. Does Poker Snowy know what the tendencies of your villain that called button are? At some point you got to realize that GTO is applicable when you play versus GTO player. Who's this guy? Otherwise, you need to play exploitative poker. So this guy comes from a more inclusive paradigm where he understands that data points in game, meaning how your environment functions, are what shift equilibriums in GTO. If button bet a lot, then you should check. Cool. If button folds a lot to c-bet but floats a lot, you should check here. That's true too. If he practically never folds to c-bet, then c-bet. Don't worry about GTO, since there's no player at your stake that plays GTO. Props in the thread. Zenfish is going to challenge that assumption. If you look at GTO solutions, you'll often see that it's so loose aggressive that it will exploit overly passive player pools, which is most player pools, without trying. Simple example, look at the average big blind 3-bet frequency versus small blind steal for the pool you're in. If it's anywhere, is that anywhere near 20%? Because that's approximately what the GTO frequency. Next paragraph. If you've adapted such a 3-bet strategy as your default with a proper range, you would do very well against your average small blind opponent. So that's true to a degree, but what he's overlooking is that we have queen-queen here. So an aggressive strategy versus a passive environment doesn't take into account that we have queen-queen. What this guy said is way more appropriate based on our exact hand, because it's giving the tendencies that the environment would need to respond with either way to incentivize queen-queen to be a bet or a check. Also, I wouldn't agree with the fact that a c-bet on this texture with air gets through enough versus 2 players. I think it's a low board that might get folded more on average than it should, but I'm not advocating going around and like betting with Jack 10 club in this spot. I don't think it's like that big of an imbalance, and I think most players are going to fuck that up on future streets because most players don't defend the turn checking range well enough um, after they see bet flop. And I really, really don't like to see guys building pots out of position with too weak of a range. Um, it just gets you into more problems on the turn. So I see where Zenfish is coming from, and I think in a way it's good. But I think he's overlooking the fact that it doesn't apply as much when we have more data, which is that we hold queen queen in our exact hand. Looks like this developed a decent amount of discussion. We shouldn't confuse GTO versus exploitative, where one is a defensive approach versus an offensive approach. This guy, I feel like this guy's like reading my blog or some shit. He's repurposing my content. GTO would be very useful versus a really good opponent, which you won't find at micros. So it seems like, in a way, he's kind of misunderstanding what Zenfish said, because Zenfish is basically saying that the pre-flop strategies are aggressive enough by default that they would naturally exploit a passive player. Or it would be very useful when we don't know our opponent, we got no intel on him. Yeah, that's when you default toward theory. It's a stabilizer when you don't have enough data points for exploits. GTO is like hiding in a bunker during a war when we got no intel on an opponent. I feel like this guy's using all my metaphors. Props though, bro. I'm glad you care. Zenfish, as explained in my first reply, this is Zenfish's retort. If you implement GTO strategies with some resemblance to GTO frequencies, especially pre-flop, you'll probably be playing a more loose-aggressive strategy and attacking form of poker than you thought was possible to win with. So I agree with what Zenfish is saying here. There's nothing really assumptive about it. He's just clarifying what Wheeler sort of seemed to overlook. Probably, but GTO is irrelevant at micros. True, but don't invalidate Zenfish's point, because all he's saying is that if you took an aggressive pre-flop strategy, it would naturally exploit the pool. I'm liking this one. That's a troll. Healthy troll. I'm Indifferent says, people who say GTO is only useful against a really good opponent just don't understand that the basis of game theory equals maximally exploitative poker. That's actually a really intelligent statement. It only becomes a Nash equilibrium, or what they are thinking of as defensive GTO, when the villain is capable of pushing back to minimize the level of hero's maximal exploit. If the villain is instead a crappy player, then game theory fundamentals will maximally crush that player. Is GTO relevant to the micros? 4 question marks. Of course it is. Game theory teaches how to maximally exploit the crappy players at the micros. I need to read more of this before I say, so I'm going to read the last paragraph to myself. What people have called exploitative poker have often been a set of false approaches now proven wrong by solvers. Okay, so I'm having a little bit of a hard time synthesizing the theme of this, but here's what I'll say. Yes, I agree with 678. In the chat, he just said, I agree with I'm Indifferent. We should study GTO to know how to better exploit. That's why you should study GTO. It's to get a better sense of where the equilibriums are, given certain pre-flop or flopping or turn ranges. Like when you set that model up at the street or decision point that you're studying, the point of studying a solver should be to understand how equilibriums shift based on deviations in player strategies, deviations from solver suggested optimal. So if we're going to say that GTO, meaning the equilibrium strategy, maximally exploits any player's deviation, that's just not true. Because if a player deviates from a mixed strategy, GTO doesn't exploit that. If it stays GTO, the only way it exploits it is if it moves back in a maximally exploitative territory. So what I like about his first sentence is that it honors the fact that GTO arrives by iterating maximally exploitative strategies back and forth until you arrive at equilibrium. That's how it happens. So if an opponent is playing shitty and he's not incentivizing us to move toward an equilibrium because he's not stepping toward the next iterated incentivized maximal exploitative strategy to our exploit, we should keep playing a maximal exploitative strategy. GTO in itself, in terms of the perfect equilibrium, is not a maximal exploitative strategy. It's just the maximal exploitative strategy that occurs when the villain is also playing the best maximal exploitative strategy he can to our last iteration. So let me simplify that. Equilibrium is the result of two players playing maximal exploitative strategies back and forth until you arrive there. That being said, all the solver ever does is take a step toward the next maximally exploitative strategy as relevant based on the opponent's last step. So if your opponent isn't taking steps closer and closer to the equilibrium by maximally exploiting you and incentivizing you to move closer, then you never actually get to game theory optimal strategies. You never actually get to a point of equilibrium, and you should stay maximally exploiting them, which is how you should be playing most of your poker as a blueprint versus a vacuumed environment. And vacuum doesn't need to just mean I never have had any history with this player. It can just mean this player has not shown a tendency to adjust in a certain line, so I'll continue to play a maximal exploitative blueprint or something like that. So I think Wheeler is potentially misunderstanding what I'm indifferent went for here, which was to say that, at least what I interpret from this is that the foundation of game theory and how solvers operate is to iterate to the next maximally exploitative strategy. That being said, GTO, the perfect equilibrium strategy, does not maximally exploit a player who's away from equilibrium. Picture it like this. Here's the equilibrium line. Here's the GTO bot. Here's the opponent deviating from his equilibrium, which would be right here. Opponent plays crappy. The best way to exploit the opponent is not to stay here. It's to go over here. Now you maximally exploit him by polarizing against his strategy and capitalizing on his imbalances. GTO and game theory are distinctive. GTO would apply versus another player that plays GTO. This is passive aggressive. I don't like it. It's verging on unhealthy trolling. By the way, you seem to really love Poker Snowy, but you should keep in mind that Poker Snowy is not GTO. Okay, true. Snowy does use game theory to derive its strategy. It uses neural networks. This has nothing to do with GTO. Let's read this. A theoretical person playing GTO strategy, however, would not be guaranteed to win the maximum in any game. While GTO strategy is unbeatable against any other given non-GTO strategy, it's not the maximum winning strategy. Both of those are true. In real games, especially with bad players, exploitative strategy will win more money. I like that post because it's simple, to the point. Cool. That was a fun thread right off the bat. I didn't know that that type of stuff went on at small stakes. So there was intelligent discussions that were a little bit misunderstanding of what each different side of the argument was trying to say, and I think that was a result of those arguments being presented in a way that was a little bit confusing. I don't think that all of the arguments were simple enough to understand. It could just be me not understanding it, but I felt like Wheeler misinterpreted Zenfish's post and also I Am Indifference post in a little bit of a way. And then I think that there was a little bit of like defensiveness when people's paradigms got challenged that I think could be given some attention, so there could just be a more healthy environment. MJ Quads, I'm having huge problems because I was under a profit share deal for a year and also coached by that guy, and he only focused on HUD and exploiting stats. So my basics are super weak because I always focused on stats and exploiting, and now I have to relearn the basics. Okay, cool. I made a post that I want everybody to check out. It's sort of like, I'll make a post like this like once every few months on my Run It Once blog, and it's kind of like my State of the Union post in terms of like, here's what I'm seeing as a trend in the community over the last few months, here's where we're at, and here's the major problem. So this post was a lot geared toward, if you continue to be a player who has an allegiance to an overly theory oriented strategy, you will start to realize that you're getting dumber and dumber as the industry evolves. Meaning that while game theory strategy has balanced the community from like 2013 through 2014, because we were at a place where all we did was what this guy's saying, like look at HUD stats, and we were too imbalanced towards exploiting. We needed to have that phase where a lot of game theory strategy was sort of pumped into the forums, and it allowed people to gain a certain foundation with how game theory works, specifically like MOP and like toy game stuff. That stuff was really good. The problem with it is that it kept running rampant, especially with the drop of the solvers, where now the solvers completely complicate any sort of implementable strategy, and they also make it confusing to try to interpret what the fuck's even going on, like why equilibriums are forming. So unless you're savvy enough to understand how to isolate filters in a solver and determine why an equilibrium is actually shifting, you run the risk of putting in a lot of work in a direction that you don't get much utility out of at all, because you don't even understand why you're getting the solutions that you're getting. And worse than that, you're getting them for reasons other than you think you're getting them. Like you could change one bet size and your entire fucking theory would go out the window. And a lot of people are like coming up with strategies that they want to implement based on the solutions that solvers are pumping out, not realizing that like you're not discovering anything brilliant. You're just reinforcing whatever sort of predefinitions you're putting into the model. Like on the model screen, when you set your bet sizes, a lot of that is affecting what's going on with the solution pump outs. And guys are making these huge deals around frequency deviations that might be worth 0.01 in EV. So it's not actually giving you a deeper understanding of equilibrium. It's confusing you by spinning you down rabbit holes where you seem to have big takeaways, but you're actually just tunneling off into over complex, irrelevant territory. So this post was about how what the community has lacked from 2015 to 2017 is the necessary balance back toward exploitative play. And it's not exploitative for the sake of exploitative. It's exploitative because it's intelligent to evolve into higher and higher data points that we have availability to on account of the fact that we have mass database filters that we can run, and we can run those against POSolver subset scripts to plot deviations in the environment. When we do that, we have a lot more vision than we used to have, so it becomes irrelevant to study GTO solver outputs because they're just not applicable. Like they're not incentivized by the environment. So why would you study something that's not incentivized anymore? It's like what Wheeler said in that post where he was saying it's like getting bunkered in a war without any vision. You would use GTO, but now we have a lot of vision. So when you look from a distorted perception, which is the GTO paradigm, which is very narrow and doesn't want to listen to the fact that there could be incentive to deviate from GTO, if you're bunkered off, you will find ways to support the fact that you should stay bunkered off because your vision is confirming your initial bias. So what we need to move toward as a community is a validation period where we say, okay, we do have extra data points at our disposal now. We need to acknowledge them and we need to integrate them into a more inclusive system where we now use the solvers to aid us in the process of developing maximally exploitative blueprints versus different type of player pools that we can apply and then calibrate from there. So a world-class exploitative player knows where to shift from the equilibrium based on what the pool is doing. That's how you get really good at exploiting, and that's how you get really good at on-the-fly thought process. We're not doing that because we're too channeled off into confirming the theory paradigm, and the reason that we're doing that, unfortunately, is because we're very, very afraid of having our paradigm challenged because there's been a lot invested in it from 2013 to 2015, and now even still there's a lot more invested in the solver era, which was 2015 to 2017. No one wants to admit that going about it in the way they insist on going about it is not actually the most accurate way anymore, because there's a lot of pain that comes from admitting that you've been wasting time, and a lot of people will suffer from their unworthiness complex getting flared up in the process of that. In other words, this shit runs deep as fuck, and it's why only the most introspective poker players are able to accelerate very quickly. Because what happens is if somebody tells you, hey man, I'm sorry, but the GTO way you've been going about it with the solvers is actually not accurate, it's actually becoming unintelligent, that person will say, well, fuck you, man, there's no way that's true, because they get triggered. And that's why what I'm looking for in these forums is triggers, because the trigger shows that you have a deep-rooted insecurity that demonstrates that you don't actually believe that the shit that you're spewing is true. You don't trust yourself completely. That's why you get triggers, or get triggered. Okay, so that's my little rant. Read that forum post if you haven't, because I really think it's the future of the industry, and the guys that get on that train quicker are going to alleviate a lot of stress and pain for themselves going into 2017. Face up range, quads on the board. This should be fun. That post that I just mentioned, that forum post, is the most recent one on my blog. Yeah, my bad, guys. Seven told me I have to get this Nightbot, and I'm going to do it for next time. I'd like to read the question first. I decided to check call this flop. Is it a good idea to check call? I don't want to blow this pot. So right there, I know this guy's coming from a defensive paradigm, because he's basing his decision on not fucking up. I don't want to fuck this pot up. If you come from that type of orientation, you're gonna fuck up, because the energetic imbalance that your mind works from is fear oriented. Like, I don't want to fuck up, I don't want to fuck up, I don't want to fuck up. And anybody who knows anything knows that that's a self-sabotaging frequency. I don't think you guys have been trained well enough to understand that you can't correct the initial imbalance that you come from in your paradigm. In other words, where your consciousness is oriented from will always confirm the very fear that you're trying to run from. So you have guys saying, I don't want to fuck up, I don't want to fuck up, who constantly fuck up. It's because that's what self-sabotage is. It's energetic law. This is the type of training that we should get in school, and we don't. So we end up going through a decade of futility in our 20s to come to the realization that there actually is energetic law to futile mental patterns, and this is one of them. First, you need to eliminate this. If you don't want to blow the pot, then focus on finding the data points that actually give you the most balanced viewpoint of what's going on, because that's going to tell you what's most naturally incentivized in a tangible, objective, accurate way. I don't want to blow this pot, right? So he's looking for confirmation that his fear is valid. I would probably bet 8-8 through 10-10, but check fold an entire range. Our hand is strong enough, and by betting we're only getting worse hands to fold. This is actually not a bad concept to operate from. It's a more beginner concept that if you can't make better hands fold and you can't get called from worse, you technically don't have a bet that's polarized enough. So the functionality of a betting hand is supposed to be polarized, so you can either get better hands to fold or make worse hands call. Okay, so I don't really have like a huge problem with his analysis in terms of how I read his context to operate from. I see it as baseline, like SSNL, but I don't see him trying to reinforce any bias past that first sentence. So let's see, he raises the cutoff with King Queen, the cutoff raise, hero 3 bets from small blind, cutoff calls. Hero checks and cutoff checks. I think what Hero meant in his post when he said, I don't want to blow this pot, is I didn't want to get blown off this flop. So initially he has, if that's true, which I think it's probably more true than not, because how else could you blow the pot by just c-betting, unless you're afraid you're going to play a huge bloated pot by bloating the pot yourself by c-betting. He probably has a paranoia that he's going to get raised here at a higher frequency than he actually is. This is where mass database filters come in to help to cleanse your bias, because the first thing you'll notice is that people don't raise flops enough, especially if you're using a half pot size c-bet or more. They still don't raise enough if you bet 1/3 though. I forgot this is quads on board, so we're going to see a hell of a run out. Hero decides to bluff turn. I think it's fine. Cutoff calls. Hero checks the river, cutoff checks. Well, I think this is a spot where I would apply that you have king high, you're not making any worse hands call, and you're not making any better hands fold because ace is the nuts. So really, you would be betting here to force him off of a split, and I think your hand just has too much equity to be placed in that type of betting range. I think that you should bet when you have like the 8-9 in this spot. See what the response is. Betting or checking the flop is fine. I assume you have some traps here with hands like aces, kings, queens, jacks that you want to check call flop. If you don't have traps here, totally fine to check. This is from a really low level context. First of all, let's get off this trapping thing. It's one of the things that I included in the mental game pack where like I had a 5-10 player using the word trap in an analysis. We're not fucking trapping people, okay? We're picking lines with certain hands that are more incentivized based on what we think their strategy is. The reason that we trap with a hand like aces or quads is because if we don't check a certain amount of strong hands, villain will bet too frequently when we check, which would incentivize us to then start checking with strong hands, because those would be the highest EV lines for our strong hands at that point. So you're always looking for what the highest EV line is for every specific hand in your range, and that's how maximally exploitative strategies eventually iterate toward equilibrium. It's not because we're fucking trapping someone. That's the low level context of it that thinks that poker is all about hand versus range. And I almost contradict myself here because I tell you guys a lot to focus on hand versus range, but when we're talking specifically in the micro sense of range versus range, we're not going to use things like I'm trapping. Trapping is something that doesn't understand range versus range dynamics and doesn't understand how equilibriums form. What's funny, Brian? You didn't like that? Aces, kings, queens are going to be good checks as they'll be blocking their continuing range draws. I don't think that's true. First of all, I don't think it's that big of a deal. Second of all, you wouldn't really want to block king queen if you could avoid it, because when you check pocket aces, you would rather have him have more king queen in his range. Or sorry, when you check pocket kings, you'd rather have him have more king queen in his range, and you block that bluff. So, oh, I see what he's saying. So you'll block their bluffs when check to, so you don't want to do that because you'd rather have them more draws. Sorry. So that's correct. I read that backwards. All right, cool. So that one's all right. Yeah, I would get off the trapping thing for sure. It's because here's the thing too, and this is part of the mental game pack that I made this note. If you're a guy who believes that you just set a trap, you're much more likely to get tunneled off into a mental bias where because you laid the trap, you'll be less likely to make a hero fold that's accurate on a future street because you're attached to the trap. You're invested in the fact that you were trapping, and you don't want to admit to the fact that something could have happened that now makes your trap go south. So it's more than anything, I think the problem with it is it generates a mental distortion that attributes too much, I call it sentimental value to the hand. Like, this was supposed to be my trap, and then everything goes to shit, and now you can't get off the trap because your mind is attached to it. That's what I would say the distortion is. Heroes UTG with ace queen on a king 10-6 flop. Looks like we're going to be three-way going to the flop with out of position against two players. Let's read the analysis before reading the line. Trapping is a trap. Good job, Aaron. Pre-flop is standard. On the flop, I decided to check because I wanted to see that middle position and button, what middle position and button will do. Having solid player called middle position, I don't really want to see bet. Otherwise, probably double barrel without any reason. So here's a spot where you could get around the step-by-step analysis of a flop like this if you develop a simplified strategy for what you're going to do when you're out of position on the flop. This is why I advocate checking range even versus one opponent who has position on you. It's because optimal c-bet strategies are very low, usually something like 25% or lower on average, and that's for heads-up pots. So here I think you would have a really low c-bet at quote-unquote optimal. So based on that, the easiest thing for you to do is to simplify toward one strategic option, which is just check flop with your entire range. And if you run that versus the solver, you'll see that You don't lose very much EV at all. You lose a very acceptable amount of EV. And in order for you to actually lose EV, they have to be stabbing very, very conservatively behind you. Like, for instance, we'll take an exaggerated version, small blind versus big blind. On ace 8-4, small blind has a range advantage. If we check our entire range there, small blind stabbing frequency drops from like 30 to 35% to like 16 to 20%, depending on pre-flop ranges. So since the environment is not going to calibrate their stabbing range to check to conservatively stab less, because they're not clairvoyant to the fact that you're checking your range, you're not going to lose as much EV as you should versus a maximally exploitative strategy, and you get the luxury of having the simplified strategy of just checking your entire range, so you can take this entire deliberation period out of your hand history analysis because you've solved it through doing your homework and realizing that there's a simplified strategy that makes a lot of sense. So, if nothing else, this conserves a lot of mental energy, but I also think it'll conserve win rate, because one of the major ways that I see guys leaking is that they c-bet with too wide of a range out of position, and then they make turn mistakes on account of not knowing how to balance that c-betting range. It's very easy for the button to exploit you, or for an in-position player to exploit you, if you imbalance your turn checking range, which is usually what happens when guys just don't double barrel enough, and then your button player just stabs behind you and scoops. It's not a very hard strategy for him to implement, which is why I don't think it takes a lot of exploitative power for him to just ruin you once he, like, you have to understand, all of the money is made in position. That's an exaggeration, but like, for all intensive simplified purposes, that's where I train guys when they come to me. As I say, we're going to focus on making more money in position and losing less money out of position. It's the intro context. Like, it's obviously elementary once you get stacking into higher levels, but like, for the most part, if a guy comes to me from this type of paradigm, which is what this student is in, or this poster is in, the first thing I'm doing with him is making it clear to him that we're going to focus on conserving our losses out of position and making more money in position by learning how to stab more effectively, push mixed strategies towards pure strategies when they're incentivized, and just fold less overall in order to exploit the imbalance of the pool, which is to c-bet too wide on the flop and check fold turn too much. Comments, my favorite part. It's a whatever spot. I think I like the flop check. The whatever spot is my favorite excuse of the poker community, because it basically just chalks it up to being a mixed strategy. The whatever spot lacks vision over what's incentivized by the environment. I think this is a more acceptable usage of the whatever spot, because I don't think we have a lot of data points to suggest that c-betting is much better or worse than checking. But if you continue to apply the whatever spot to all mixed strategy situations over the course of the hand, as you have an increase in data points that could allow you to find an exploitative option, that's when you're going to encounter problems. That's when you're going to find yourself as a player who, when he looks through his lost pots for the day, walks away after looking at 30 lost hands and says, they were all whatever spots. You don't get better like that. You get better by pushing your capacity to detect data points that are actually most incentivized to show you whether or not you should lean a mixed strategy, toward a pure strategy one way or the other. I had some sriracha sauce for lunch today on this new diet, and it's fucking my shit up. I like checking the flop as we're not getting much folds on this flop. It's something that I'm noting too, that like when a middle position and cutoff player call you, I would guess it's going to be hard for you to have an exploitative amount of fold equity on a flop like King 10 X 2-tone. That being said, we have a really good randomizer, so I do think it's kind of a whatever spot. You'll hear me say that very, very rarely though. And for the sake of making sure we have a simplified strategy that works well with a low amount of mental energy and is consistently implementable in a way that doesn't get us involved in spots that we don't know what the fuck we're doing, I think checking range is definitely the way to go here. If we do bet flop, we're in a weird situation on the turn. So he's going into, like, it feels funny to end up on the turn out of position with a gutter, which is more of a general aversion to feeling like weird in a hand, which is not really acceptable at higher level contexts. Like, there's going to be times where you have to accept that you're in a weird spot, but it's still the highest EV line to play, the line that you took to get there. We can check call this flop with nutted outs anyways. I assume you're going to be checking some King X on this flop. All that stuff is just way too baseline and way too contracted. Like, guys who are worried about are we defending some premium hands as checks? I'm assuming you're calling some king X. All of that is like specifically focused on a tier of the range, and it never comes back into an inclusive analysis of how the range versus range dynamics function. So the problem with the community for the most part is that most guys are in this paradigm where they think that what good ranging skills are focusing on, is your range protected by this tier and this tier? Can you have good balance in this checking line? When it's not really relevant for making good decisions on future streets. What's more relevant is you understand like the range versus range asymmetries and overall the patterns of how you usually make money in certain lines post flop. Like I know that if this flop goes check check, I can usually barrel twice and have it be an exploitable result where I'll get too much fold equity. I know that because I've done the mass database filters to see that, and so that ends up being a much more inclusive level of my context where I'm thinking about much less analytically in terms of the micro ranging. But what I see is many millions of hands have shown that these fuckers fold too much after they check back the flop. And that's not that hard to see. It happens because people check back their capping range too much, and they're not trained to call the type of aggressive strategies that they need to call over two streets once you reopen. So I've talked about this before, but when you get to more advanced levels of analysis, and this was done in studies of like chess players, the grandmaster sees more than the expert, but he's thinking about much less consciously because his study has integrated higher data points to be able to show or prove to him without having to think that there's a really profitable line to go down that doesn't need analysis because it's proven through a lot of data. Texture obviously matters, but when you see the type of deviations that we've seen across all textures, the Bayesian probability that they're overcalling on any single one texture goes way, way down. If you see that they're overfolding versus turn stab 8 to 10% of the time at SSNL, hint, hint, you know that it's very, very rare that you're going to find a turn situation on a texture where they're actually overcalling. At best, they're probably calling enough. And there's all these spots where they're folding way too much. I'm done with this one. It's coming from too low of a context, and it's too long. Like, he's supporting everything through combinatorics, so it's not rooted in any sort of inclusive data that is useful on the spot. I've been running this drill with my students lately. You guys are going to see it if you're members of Run It Once Elite. It's going to be the next video where I get them to a reverse situation and I put them on a fucking clock. I say 30 seconds, go. Now tell me every single relevant data point. There's usually only 3 that you're going to use to make your exploitative decision on the river. And if they want to argue that they don't have enough data, then they go for the theory-oriented approach. That's the solution when you don't have enough data points. But it's a super helpful drill because it simulates the environment. It simulates what situation they'll be in when they get to a river and they face aggression and they're on the spot having to go, okay, data points are here. I have 30 seconds to find them. Let's go. So it's becoming my favorite way of training. And I think it's like the guys who I've used it with have said it's been more valuable than like anything else we've done together. But it takes a certain amount of training to get you to that point because I've got to get you familiar with as many data points as I have for your environment before I can expect to throw you into a river situation where you can sift through those data points in the certain line that you're in and utilize them. Hey Nick, almost done with your content for the first round. When it comes to multi-way situations, I actually don't know how to implement your pure flop strategies of checking and betting range on some boards and fall back on my mixed strategy system that is on the same level. How would you work with it? It's a good point. The first hand that we did in the forum is kind of a good example of this, where we had a queen-queen multi-way pre-flop raise on 8-5-3 two-tone. We had a player who was in position and a player who was out of position. Basically, I will default toward a more exploitative strategy based on the hand that I have, the more that I think there's imbalances going on in one of the two players. So one of the things I can say is the most important is identify how fishy the big blind is. Because if he's a player who's playing wide pre-flop stats and also will drag along post-flop with weaker ranges, that's a guy you're not going to want to sacrifice a street of value with overpairs. So I would see that all day with my value if that player's in the pot. So at that point, my strategy becomes very exploitative because my c-bet range now might look like strong top pair plus and gutters plus, or strong backdoor flush draw plus. I'll make sure that my randomizers are very robust, and I'm not going to be bluffing enough, most likely. That being said, if I don't have reads on the villains, that's the time where I'll usually check my entire range. But the funny thing is, even if I don't have reads, the odds that one of them is a fish is good enough in the environments that I play on. Like even at 10-20 Bovada, the odds that one of the players behind you or in the pot with you is a fish is usually pretty good, even if it's the first hand at the table with all of them. So at that point, it helps to know the blueprint makeup of the environmental alias. If I know that like 10 to 15% of the Bovada environment is maniacs. Let's say like 5 to 10% of Bovada are maniac aggros, and then another 10 to 15% are really, really loose passive fish. And then 40% are nit regs, and then up and up, like 20% are good regs or whatever. Then I know that my blueprint strategy should probably be geared around using a pure strategy with overpairs in a multi-way flop, because I'm just going to have a higher distribution of fish in the pot with me than I technically should if everybody was playing really well. So in those cases, I'm not interested in sacrificing a street of value with an overpair because I just don't see enough incentive to do it. Unless, like for instance, like what Wheeler said in the first forum post, like unless I knew the button was stabbing wide behind, that would be a cool reason. So for the most part, when I'm totally readless, I think I'm still favoring betting with the overpairs, and I'll be very, very careful with poorly randomized bluffs. Like I'll probably check back the bottom 30% of my solver suggested C betting range, because I don't think that it gets through enough versus two players when one of them is a fish more often than they should be, at least one of them. So that's the general blueprint that I go through. I do still check range a lot versus stronger opponents when I'm multi-way, because I think that, I guess you could say it's because I think that balance becomes more important versus those guys, but only because I don't have as clear of an exploit in terms of a pure strategy being incentivized either way with a certain type of hand. So I'm not doing it for the sake of balance. I'm doing it from a maximal exploitative mindset, which is geared around the idea that if I can't find a good data point to suggest that my hand should be a pure strategy one way or the other, I'm going to revert toward the balanced way of doing it because I think that actually makes the most sense. But I'm not starting from like, oh, I'm reverting toward balance for the sake of balance. I'm reverting toward balance because I can't support that I should be maximally exploiting one way or the other. So it goes back to what Apotheosis was saying. At least I hope this is what he was saying, was that the heart of GTO in terms of solver land, what the solvers are actually doing is iterating maximal exploitative strategy back and forth until they arrive at equilibrium. I want to do an over-under on how many times I do this with my hands today, but that will become my new equilibrium caricature. Cool. So here I'm dismissing this analysis because it's too combinatoric oriented, and because of that I know that it's too contracted on looking at combinations. Anytime you become too contracted on combinatorics, your focus gets tunneled off and you lose sight of more inclusive data points given by the environment or just range versus range on interaction overall. So and that's a good way to sort of indicate, like a good indicator for whether or not you should pay attention to someone's analysis is if they're still doing stuff like listing every combination in your range or pasting you the poker stove output of like the fucking 10 lines of equities given range versus range on the flop. Like fuck all that. That's so ancient, and it requires very little of you in terms of introducing higher and higher inclusive data points into your analysis. Because basically what that says is poker stove is the extent of the data points that I'm willing to find in my environment. Well, if you would put 50 to 100 hours into mapping your environment through plotting your own database and then running it against PO solver subscripts, you would have a way better metric for giving advice. 3-bet in position, late positions battle. That's a cool title. Decided to mix it up and 3-bet with this hand. Unknown opponent. If you want to get really nitpicky, we could say that versus a totally unknown opponent, we should have a blueprint 3-bet strategy by filtering for how much the environment folds to 3-bets as a total alias, and then applying that blueprint versus the imbalance of that alias. So for instance, if you find out that your small stakes no limit environment folds over 50% of the time from the position that this villain is opening from, you should probably be 3-betting really aggressively with your quote unquote mixed strategy hands every time versus an unknown. At the beginning, I'm trying to create a loose image. That doesn't really make a lot of sense. It does if you're playing a long game of trying to exploit a loose image, but really in the beginning, unless you have a very good idea that your entire game plan is built around building a loose image and then capitalizing by countering that image, that's not really a great game plan because you need to play long sessions to be able to do that. And like a lot of times, 3 or 4 guys at your table who you're building an image with will leave by the time you get to hand 100 of your session. So I would say the more relevant way to go is to play the most incentivized plus EV strategy or action point at any given time, which here would be to 3-bet not to create a loose image, but to 3-bet because it's actually immediately incentivized by the frequencies of defense that your villain's going to play versus 3-bet. I'm getting real nitpicky in the threads today. Nick, do you play heads up or have you studied heads up pools? If that's the case, is it harder to find general imbalances? I haven't like focused on heads up. I would table start a lot at 10-20 just because I thought I was like way better than anybody else who wanted to jump in. I'm talking about when I was doing really well, Bovada 6 max. I noticed that ranges are wider and it lends itself to more aggressive strategies really pummeling. I think my red line started to go up a lot more toward the end of that sample when I was playing heads up and three-way, which is a pretty good indicator that I was winning the small ball war, and not just in a way that like created a different type of graph without gaining win rate. I was doing it in a way that was actually gaining win rate through red line increase. So overall, like I would say that heads up is a good thing to move into once you have confidence in your versatility and calibration skills as a player. Like you need to have decently refined aggression to be able to be a good heads up player. And then I think it lends itself to more hotspot territories where the opponents are unfamiliar with the type of mandatory defense frequencies they'll have to play in order to fare well against you. So I like that part of it a lot. That like the person who studies the data more will be the guy who walks away with a more exploitative blueprint that he can implement. That being said, heads up also counters much faster. So if you're playing an opponent who understands equilibrium and you're going after him quite hard, it's to be expected that he'll adjust to you faster. And then at that point, you're playing more of a psychological war. You're playing this battle of, okay, what information is my opponent receiving from me? How capable is he, based on what he's showing me so far, of him reacting to that? And then how hardcore do I want to get with playing the leveling game with him? And that's like a whole nother art of psychology that I feel like over the course of 50 to 100 hands, I'm very, very good at, but I really haven't put it in large sample heads ups to know what type of strategy I would take after like the 4th round of us iterating maximal exploitative strategies against each other. Because I tend to go hard as fuck with the exploits I deploy from the start, because I think I'm maximally exploiting the lack of information he has on me just from the jump. And then by 100 hands, he's like, this guy's fucking nuts and will go after me a ton. So he's countering a decent amount. And I really don't have much experience playing more than like 100 hands heads up with someone like over the last year or so. And I think that one of the things I don't like about it all that much is that I know it would become more of a psychological war versus a good player. It would force us to converge more toward balance. And then it would be a more subtle game of exploits where both of us are forced to play more of a balanced strategy, and I just see my win rate going down substantially. So I don't know that like I would want to play. I think if I played heads up, I'd be the guy that sat like 5-10 or 10-20 across all the B-list sites and scooped up the fish and then challenged different regs to like 100 or 150 hand battles before the table went 3-way, and then we'd play 3-way to 6 max. I don't think I would sit like at a heads up table and like challenge another good player to like a 500 hand war. Not because I don't think I could adapt, but just because it's not that inspiring to me to play that form of poker when I know that, like, okay, if I'm there to make money, I'm going to play the form of poker that I know is most lucrative. And there's other guys who have shit to prove, but like I'm past the point where I really need to prove anything in terms of like getting to super nosebleeds or like being the top heads up player at my table or at my limit or my site. An interesting point this brings up. I was talking to a student recently. He's playing on a site where there's this one heads up guy that spreads every 5, 10, 3, 6 table. It's one guy and he has a monopoly over the bum hunting for heads up. And I said, well, what do you think of this guy? What do you know about him? And he said, he's probably just some okay heads up guy that challenges all the other regs and does okay. And nobody eventually wants to fuck with him because most guys are probably break even versus this guy on the site. So this guy is just a guy that shows up every day, puts in the hustle, and has a monopoly over the bum hunt. The value in that is that this guy fucking scoops all the dead money from the site that pours upward into the highest stakes at the limit. So what I told my student is, it might be very smart of you if you want to get to the point where you challenge this fucker for his position at King of the Mountain. Because if you give him enough of a hard time by sitting heads up with him daily, because he's showing up, no one else is showing up to battle with him at this point, then what will happen is if you beat the fuck out of him over like a 20,000 hand sample, he won't be able to sit at those tables anymore. And then the added implies of that is that every single one of his fish is now your fish. So it's kind of cool. Johnny C, is 5 million hands enough for reg database analysis on a small site? I don't think the site really... Okay, so if you're specifically trying to do unique regular database analysis, like categorize each reg at your limit, and then try to create maximally exploitative blueprints against them, I think 5 million is like okay, but you won't get river samples like at all. Brian's right. It's enough to get high frequency spots. So you can get like good flop information, but you won't get texture information even on the flops. I don't think you'll get like a very low amount of like pattern recognition texture stuff on the flop, and then you'll get none of that turn to river, and you'll probably get like the most basic turn frequency lines with an okay sample size. I would say that if you guys are dead serious about exploring your limit and mapping it, you need to get at least 15 million, probably closer to 30 million. One thing I've been working with guys lately is like, if your site doesn't have that many hands that you can buy, you've got to start thinking about buying from other sites that sort of mimic that environment. And if you have a problem with buying hands, get out of the victimized terms of service paradigm that they have you convinced that it's an immoral thing to do. It's just slowing down your progress, and it's not a rule that's set up in your benefit. It's a rule that's set up for poker stars to make more fucking money because they're scumbags. 15 million is a good estimate, yeah. I'm not even sure if a lot of other sites have spoken out against terms of service um, for buying hand histories. It's something that I'd be interested to see if they even care. But I think it's something that's going to be done away with once, because they can't enforce it, like period. And there's still sites doing it. My recommendation was that the sites should just give the hands away for free. That way they take the middleman out, which is the sketchy part of it. There's a third party selling hands. If the sites didn't like it that much that there was a third party doing it, what they should do to equalize the whole fucking thing is just make hands downloadable. That's why I thought Bovada had a good model at first, because they were the only site that was doing that. And to make it downloadable, like in the past, like you can download all hands ever played at that limit in the last like year. Let's move to some MSNL in the last 15 minutes. Poker as my profession. Bankroll management. Seven, I saw you responded to this one. I was trolling these a couple nights ago. So this guy's basically asking, what type of bankroll do I need to move to Nevada and play full time? Is Ignition a good place to play online? Yes. Your best bet for someone who lives in the States. What stake should I be playing with a bankroll of 50,000? Well, that depends how much you trust your ability. If you're sure that you belong at 510, you don't need more than a 30 to 50 buy-in bankroll to assert yourself at 3.6 in order to prove that you belong at 510. This is a good point, by the way. I'm doing this new fitness program now, and I met with my trainer for an hour and a half the other night, and he said something that resonated with me on a poker wisdom level, which is sort of how I analyze everything now. Like, I understand that they're core truths to success in every field, and when I see one of those emerge, when I'm getting advice in another field, it resonates very much with me, and I know to trust it because it's like one of those core pillar truths, like one of those really smart things that you do if you have your shit together in a certain industry. So the one that he stated was that if you're trying to bust through a plateau and you hit a plateau in a certain weight, you go back and make sure that the previous workout that you did still sticks. That's how you know that you just showed up and were stressed out the day that you didn't bust through your plateau. So you're trying to determine whether or not you're overtrained or whether or not you were just stressed out that day. If you go back to your previous workout that was successful and you find out you can't even do that one, now you know you have to back up even more. But you're basically doing this thing of like taking a step back in order to move forward most efficiently. So you fuck up your workout that day, you immediately drop weight and finish that workout. Then the next time you arrive, you don't try the same workout again. You go back to the previous one, lock it in, then go forward again. So with this type of thing, start at 600 first if you think you're a 510 player. Prove to yourself that you're crushing 600 for a month, then move to 510. A lot of what causes guys inefficiency is when they overshoot their potential, or overshoot what their actual skill level currently is, and then they drop 20K trying to place 510 that month, and then they're in a situation now where their bankroll is much more threatened, and they can't even play the stakes comfortably that they could be crushing. Oh yeah, that's true. I don't think you could play Ignition from Bovada. Or you can't play Ignition from Nevada. What stakes should I be playing with a bankroll of 50,000? So again, depends on how high you think your win rate is at the limit that you're going to start at, because you can plot standard deviation stuff like that. I mean, there's tools that you can use for that. 200 to 300 buy-in rule sounds like ridiculous for cash games, probably a lot better for MTTs. If you're playing a $300 buy-in rule for cash games, you're just a pussy. Sorry. How does reporting tax work when winning and losing in poker, live versus online? It's basically on the honor system in live, and you can do whatever feels like it's in your integrity. If you do win a tournament, though, they report it. So there's that. Should I have a 6-month reserve for living expenses? I think that's a really good idea, just because it'll take pressure off your mental if you do have a losing month. Again, though, that depends how stressed you are as a person who has a losing month and knows that you don't have a 6-month cushion. It all comes down to how much you trust yourself. Like, that's the key to this post, is that, like, and this is something that Seven said that I agree with, but in a slightly different way. Seven said, the general rule of thumb is if you have to ask these questions, then you're probably not already winning enough to call it a career. I would rephrase that and say, if you're asking these questions, you don't trust yourself enough to be a long-term professional. So few people understand how much of this hinges on self-trust, because there's no fucking one-size-fits-all blueprint for telling you like what schedule you should be on, how many buy-ins you should use, and what stakes you should play. It's all very much derived by what feels resonant to you as a person, and so much of that in terms of what's going to cause you stress and what you can deal with is based on how much you trust yourself. If you took a nosebleed player right now and threw him back in a small stakes environment, or told him, hey bro, you get to move to Nevada with 50,000, how are you going to do it? I'm pretty sure he'd be much more aggressive than the typical guy who posts this type of post in a run at once forum. The simple reason being that he trusts himself much more. He's already embodied the energetic kingdom of someone who belongs at high stakes, and that's everything. Like, the more you guys see that your paradigm literally dictates your growth pattern, the more you can accept the fact that, like, this stuff is much less tangible than you think. Like, it's not about the perfect blueprint that just works. You can't just copy shit and expect it to work. I've been saying that a lot lately. Everything works from within a bigger context, and a lot of what dictates the efficiency of your context is how much trust you have in it. How much are you in conflict? How much are you in conflict with the context that you've developed? Because if you don't fucking believe yourself on a day-to-day basis that you can actually do it, and I mean that from the micro of showing up and winning in poker, or to the macro of like making this schedule work for you, like making this macro view of your career work for you, you're gonna fucking sabotage yourself. Just like that guy who's posting that question, like, I don't want to blow this pot. He thinks he's managing a situation well, but he's actually sabotaging the quality of his thought process. So the two things that you need the most in order to have accelerated growth are tools and trust. You need to actually find something that's coming from a high caliber approach that can scale itself for your growth. And then you need trust. And this is the key thing about coaching too. You need to trust in yourself that you have the ability to sense when someone is trustworthy, or, well, okay, this is difficult. You need to either trust in yourself enough to do it yourself, or if you can't trust yourself, you have to at least trust yourself to find someone to put your trust in. And that goes back to what I said about me not wanting to train the slight 200 NL winner who's an arrogant bastard, because that guy doesn't trust himself. And the reason he gets triggered when I'll give him advice is because it challenges his paradigm, and he already knows his paradigm hasn't worked for him, which is why he seeks out coaching to begin with. And then he's not humble enough to accept that he needs to start going about it differently. So if you don't have the trust aspect, you have to find someone who you can put your trust in so that you can rapidly accelerate the paradigm. Like, this is what paradigm ascension is. Finding a way to portion your trust off into someone else because you're not secure enough to handle it yourself through an independent learning pattern that you organize, and then you put all your faith in someone to basically scale your growth for you. It's kind of like what I did in the fitness industry right now. All my fucking attention is on helping my students to scale their growth because I have people that have put all their trust in me. I don't have time to go learn about the fucking nutrition industry. It's just not something that I can allot into my schedule. So I made a decision to research someone who I felt like had results that I trusted and seemed to come from a really like caring place with his students. And I said, okay, this is the same thing I do, and I love the way my industry works. I'm hiring this guy, and I put my complete faith in him, and I'll do whatever the fuck he says because I've already vetted him. Like, I've already vetted him for knowing that this guy's legitimate, he has results. If at any point I feel like the situation is out of integrity, I'll step out of the program and I'll get someone else. So it's just something I feel extremely strong about, that like there is no magic pill for your bankroll management. You have to be in touch with yourself enough to trust whether or not it's going to work for you. Otherwise, it just won't work. Like, you'll find a way to fuck it up. RBK, I'm playing 30 to 60 spins. 30, 60 S spins. Spinning goes, and I'm making 20 an hour. Should I buy all your packs and switch to the no limit hold'em 6 max? I can't answer that question for you because you need to look more into what would satisfy you in terms of a schedule. Like, do you like the way that the sit and go grind makes you feel? Are you satisfied with how that system scales? For instance, what's the increment that you could scale to at sit and goes? What's the end game? Have you thought about it? Are you going to build enough of a bankroll that you can play high stakes MTTs? And then do you like playing the MTT schedule? Are you going to be a long-term sit and go grinder and play 1K sit and goes? You have to know what your end game is and how much it inspires you before I'm able to tell you that you should fucking switch to no limit hold'em and go through a 3-month regression where you'll probably lose for 3 months before you even start winning, unless you work your ass off. So I sort of told myself I wasn't going to go into this today, but every single fucking question is leading me into it. I received an email yesterday that I felt strongly about. It was a player who contacted me out of the blue, and he basically told me that his situation was that he was currently staked by a backer who had shifted him over to PLO after he had been struggling for 7 months to make a minimum amount of profits at no limit hold'em. He said, I'm absolutely miserable. My day-to-day is just completely torture. I'm losing at PLO, and I don't feel like my backer has the capacity to train me, or I don't feel like he cares enough. Please tell me what you would honestly do, Nick, in this spot. And I get that email and I'm like, well, fuck, like, I don't know who this guy is, so there's no reason for me to respond to this other than the fact that I have a lot of empathy for that type of struggle. So I sat down and I was like, okay, here's the deal. I think your backer is a fucking idiot. I think anybody who moves a struggling no and hold'em player to a completely different game and expects that that's going to work because the backer has figured out that the cap on PLO growth is going to be easier to blast through because of the fact that the PLO environment is just easier to beat. That guy's a fucking shallow-minded douchebag because he also is not empathetic toward the student's situation in terms of stress. Do you know how much stress you're going to put on a player who moves from Noam and Hold'em as a struggler to PLO in the first 3 months of his career, especially when you haven't even gained enough of his trust to prove that you can scale him in his growth process? The problem is that your backer couldn't fucking train you how to beat Noam at Hold'em. Now he's desperate to try to turn some profit out of you, and he switches you to a game that he has a hunch will be better in the long term for your profits. He doesn't give a fuck about you. The amount of backing and private coaching services that don't actually care about their clientele is fucking ridiculous. And my entire approach in 2017 will be to take every single unsatisfied customer from every single one of those private coaching rings and spin them into a private, loving empire of support that I will build because I will work harder and smarter than any single one of those fucking industries. Like, it's all private shit. I'm not talking about like the big coaching sites because they're off the hook. They've said that they're not trying to be a private coaching ring. They're not doing staking. They're just a platform. They're a platform for content. I have a problem with the fucking private guys who treat their customers like a credit card company treats credit card customers. All they want is to suck you in, lock you in, and then get the fucking minimums out of you for the rest of your life while you bleed away, and they don't give a shit how you feel because they don't care about you. So my entire thing with this coaching revolution that I'm starting, that I will continue to scale, is that I'm very well aware that it doesn't scale well. It doesn't scale well because the amount of time that I have to put in privately with every student requires me to give up a ton of my time. But at the same time, I'm willing to put in, 8 hours a day in lessons to do that. So by 2017, I will have privately trained probably 150 to 300 new guys. And from there, that scales itself naturally because now I actually am known in the industry as someone who not only gets results, but gives a fuck about whether or not you get results. And that'll be the difference. No one's playing the long game in terms of the coaching industry. All you have is guys who offer fucking coaching for profits, get you locked in, and then could give a fuck because all they do is upload video content from 2008 that'll teach you how to win at zero point 0.5 BBs per 100. It's shit. It's a shit model. And the only reason I'm still in poker is because there's just so much room for penetrating the market with something different that actually works because it comes from the right energy. Like, I could probably go off and do something else, but I have to say I'm more inspired to stay here because I see that the status quo of what's available for people who are struggling a shitload is just like completely below what it should be. So here's my statement publicly to anyone who owns a private coaching or staking ring. I will single-handedly take every single one of your clients who are unsatisfied because you don't give a fuck enough about them or because you don't trust yourself enough to be teaching in the first place. And I will transform them into something that they deserve to be because these are guys that are coming to you with ambition. And it's a fucking problem when you take a weak-minded person who puts his faith in you and manipulate him for your own bottom line. 229, I think that's going to do it. I want to shout out Tim, my student from last time. Tim can offer anyone 65% rake back on micro. I'm offering it to the guys who are staking first, who are not staking, supporting the thread. If you're interested in that, hit me up at nick@pokerdetox.com and we'll get you set up. This has been fun. I've definitely been ranting more than in the hand history videos, but I think it's needed because I think I need to clarify like what the fuck is actually going on with people getting manipulated and what I plan to do about it from a position of actually caring more. Brian, can you think of anything else in terms of announcements? Brian's been working really hard on uploading everything to YouTube. So all of the streams will be repurposed and available permanently there because we found out that Twitch deletes everything 2 weeks after. Thank you guys for coming out. You have my infinite support, and I honor every single one of your ambition. Friday we'll be back with a hand history. I might make an announcement like on the blog that I need to sub someone in for Friday. I don't think I have anybody totally locked in yet. So check it out. Come tomorrow. I'll figure it out. Peace, guys.